They appear twice, once standing under the wind, waiting to be sealed, once singing on Mount Zion with the Lamb. Between those two appearances, something in the narrative has shifted so dramatically that the very question, who are the 144,000, must be asked again with new urgency. Who are they, according to the text itself? That is the question we will follow closely, not to impose a doctrine on the pages of Revelation, but to listen to what the book insists upon, to note the details Scripture gives, and to let those details shape the possible answers. John writes from exile on Patmos to communities under pressure. The Roman world pushes for conformity, sacrifices to Caesar, loyalty tests that are often economic as well as religious, and the vision of Revelation answers a fearful, "Who will stand when the cosmic order trembles?" 6:17. Into that trembling world, Revelation inserts a startling scene. Angels restrain the winds, a seal is given, and a specific number is announced. 144,000, sealed from the tribes of Israel, 7:1-8. The image is at once juridical and pastoral. God takes possession of a people. God marks them to endure. If we are to answer the title question faithfully, we must begin where the book begins to define them. The sealing scene in chapter 7. That scene does not appear as an isolated curiosity. It sits between the seals and the trumpets. It answers the cosmic panic of chapter 6, and it offers reassurance in terms that would matter most to first-century Christians facing ritual pressure and social exclusion. The seal, Greek sphragus, is not a trivial detail. In the ancient world, a seal served as a signet. It indicated ownership, authenticated a document, secured property against tampering. For John's first readers, a divine seal would convey that those who bear it belong to God, are recognized by God, and in some sense are kept or protected within the divine purview as judgment intensifies. The scene opens with 4 angels at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the winds so that no wind should blow on the earth or sea or tree. The image itself is evocative of control over destructive forces. Another angel ascends from the east, bearing the divine seal, and he commands the others to wait until the servants of God are sealed on their foreheads. Then the oracle. 144,000 from every tribe of the sons of Israel are sealed, 12,000 from each named tribe. The language is precise, even rhythmic. 12 by 12 times 1,000, mathematical exactness within an apocalyptic imagination. We must pause on the number. Revelation's numerology is theological rhetoric. 12 multiplied by 12 multiplied by 1,000. The factors matter. 12 itself evokes Israel. 12 tribes, 12 sons, the 12 gates, city foundations of the New Jerusalem in chapter 21. The doubling of 12 suggests a reinforced fullness, corporate completeness, perhaps intensified covenantal identity. Multiplying by 1,000 gives cosmic scale, vastness wrapped in symbolic precision. To call 144,000 literal or merely symbolic strips the number of its textual function. The text wants both particularity and universality, a definitively marked group, described by a number that signals the whole of God's covenant people restored and multiplied to cosmic proportions. Any adequate reading must hold together the symbolism and the narrative specificity. If the number points to fullness, the list of tribes complicates the picture. John names 12 ancestral markers, but not the canonical list one might expect. Notably absent is Dan. Ephraim, usually prominent in symbolic accounts as the leading northern tribe, is also missing. In their place, John includes Levi and Manasseh, arrangements that would scramble the expectations of anyone steeped in Jewish genealogical formulas. The deviations matter. Revelation did not accidentally misname the tribes. The text wants the reader to notice. Why would Dan be omitted? The Old Testament offers some resonant possibilities. Judges 18 narrates how Dan came to settle in a new territory and establish an illicit cultic center, a figurative relocation that, in later memory, presses Dan into narratives of idolatry. Jeroboam's calf cults and the prophetic condemnations of northern Israel, think Amos's sharp denunciations of Samaria's elitism and sin, form a backdrop against which Dan and Ephraim can be associated with spiritual unfaithfulness. Genesis 49 depicts Jacob's blessing, where Dan is said to provide justice for his people, and later is described with imagery of a serpent or ambusher. The image is ambiguous and can be read as a warning. Ezekiel's later vision of the restored allotments, Ezekiel 48, reinserts Dan, which suggests the possibility that exclusion in Revelation is not final damnation, but a functional or rhetorical choice. The omission signals unfaithfulness or disqualification in a particular narrative frame, rather than eternal erasure. The inclusion of Levi and the separate mention of Manasseh likewise carry cues. Levi, as the priestly tribe, would not normally appear in lists focused on territorial allotments. His presence points to cultic and worship dimensions, those set apart for service before God. Manasseh's separate naming, apart from Joseph, recalls how Joseph's double portion, through his sons Ephraim and Manasseh, complicates simple tribal tallies. These anomalies pressure us away from a reductionist reading. If John wanted to convey a plain, ethnic census of Israel, he chose a strikingly odd way of doing it. The text's particularity invites interpretation. It refuses easy assimilation into a single, modern category. We must also attend to how the sealing functions in the narrative economy. The sealed are not simply counted. They are characterized implicitly as God's possession, recognized before the winds are loosed or the coming judgments fully break upon the earth. The seal is a mark of belonging and, in John's theology, of endurance. It is counterpoint to another mark that will appear later in the book, the mark of the beast. Where the beast's mark will bind allegiance to an imperial idolatrous order, the divine seal binds allegiance to the Lamb. The parallel is not accidental, it is legal, symbolic, existential. One seal indicates ownership by the imperial order, the other indicates ownership by the divine sovereign. The question of identity, therefore, is not only ethnic but confessing and existential. Whom do you follow under pressure? For readers in the Roman provinces, the metaphor would have been urgent. Public sacrifice to Caesar could determine an individual's place in society, their ability to trade, to be considered a citizen in practice. To be sealed by God, in that context, would mean to be recognized by a higher authority whose ownership supersedes civic penalties. John's vision assures readers that divine registration precedes earthly punishment. Being named on God's roster confers a status that imperial decrees cannot finally subvert. Yet the book does not say that the seal guarantees painless life or exemption from suffering. The very image of soldiers, persecution, and the Lamb who was slain points to the cost of fidelity. Language matters as we try to state who these sealed ones are, according to the text. Revelation 7 calls them slaves or servants of God, doulos in Greek, an idiom of belonging and obedience. They are not anonymous cosmic figures. They are covenant people whose identity is written by God. Moreover, they are sealed on their foreheads, a location that in apocalyptic literature often signifies conscious allegiance, the mark that is visible, that announces identity publicly. That same locational motif resurfaces in chapter 14, where names are written on foreheads, intensifying the idea of visible loyalty. But we must not stop at the seal. Revelation produces a careful movement, first sealing, later worship. That movement teaches us that identity under trial is shaped not only by legal belonging, but by formation in suffering and song. The 144,000 who are sealed in chapter 7 are not presented as finished products. They are a marked people, undergoing the narrative's trajectory toward worshipful vindication. Thus, the text's answer to "Who are they?" begins with legal belonging, sealed servants, but the narrative will require us to follow them into fidelity that is lived and sung. Before we follow them further, it is important to consider how ancient interpreters read the anomalies of the tribal list. From the 2nd century onward, Christian writers noticed the absence of Dan and the odd inclusions. Irenaeus and Hippolytus, for example, read the omission eschatologically. They associated Dan with future deception and even with the figure of the enemy in the last days. These patristic readings exhibit two features worth noting. First, they take the text seriously and seek theological meaning in its irregularities. They do not assume scribal error. Second, their interpretive move is historically conditioned, shaped by their own concerns about orthodoxy, heresy, and the identity of the church under pressure. Their witness is valuable for tracing how early communities read Revelation, but it is not final proof of the only possible exegesis. We must weigh their judgments against the text's own internal logic and against its Old Testament reference. The Old Testament background gives us a richer sense of why certain tribes would carry specific connotations. Dan's association with idolatrous practice, for instance, has deep roots. Judges 18 tells how Dan migrated and set up a carved image, and later prophetic writings connect northern Israel, often identified corporately with Ephraim, with apostasy and social injustice. Amos denounces the northern elite and their sacrificial systems. Hosea laments spiritual unfaithfulness. When John composes his list, these memories are not neutral. They generate resonance about who is faithful and who has been compromised. That is part of Revelation's rhetorical artistry. It summons the memory of Israel's past unfaithfulness to shape a theological diagnosis of present spiritual risk. At the same time, Ezekiel's vision of a restored Israel, including a reallocation of tribal lands that reinserts Dan, warns us against reading omission as permanent exclusion. Ezekiel imagines a future in which the tribes are reconciled and restored. That suggests John's list operates within a particular function, to mark a group fit for fidelity in the present crisis, not necessarily to pronounce ultimate judgment on any tribe for all time. Thus, the textual dynamics remain complex. Omission can signal a current disqualification, a rhetorical emphasis, or a memory of past failure, while later prophetic imagination gestures toward restoration. We should also look at how John's wording frames identity. Sealed from the tribes of the sons of Israel asserts a rootedness in Israel's story. Yet Revelation's other images, angels, cosmic judgments, the Lamb, draw on a broader symbolic economy that reaches beyond ethnic boundaries. The book repeatedly stresses that worshippers come from every nation, tribe, people, and tongue, e.g. 5-9, 7.9, in the later picture of the great multitude. So when John gives the 144,000 a tribal formula, one should not assume he is insisting they are exclusively ethnic Jews in the modern sense. He uses the language of Israel to designate a covenant people, one that can be read as ethnically particular, as spiritually reconstituted, or as a combination of both. The text leaves room for layered meanings, and an honest reading must admit that ambiguity. Another crucial note: the sealing occurs amid action. The four angels hold back winds. They are preventing catastrophe so that sealing may occur. This dramaturgy emphasizes timing. The seal is bestowed before full judgment pours forth. It is preemptive. Theologically, that timing tells us that God's recognition and possession come in the moment of decision. The sheep are marked before they must withstand the wind. In apocalyptic theology, this timing operates as assurance. God identifies the faithful before history's worst convulsions complete their work. But again, The seal does not render life comfortable. The sealed may still suffer, but their identity is no longer hostage to imperial coercion. Moreover, the seal's relational function links the sealed to a unique ethical demand. Being marked on the forehead suggests public witness. The book's ethic is not private piety, but visible allegiance. The seal functions as a sign of public confession, as a four-fronted declaration that cannot be hidden in times when pressures mount for conformity. That public aspect ties closely to the other motif the Lamb's followers will later embody: costly discipleship. The sealed are being prepared for an identity of following that will require visible confession under pressure. So far, the text has given us several building blocks: a legal owning sign, as fragis, a numbered group whose figure suggests fullness, 12x 12x 1000, a strange tribal roster that invites historical theological explanation, and a dramatic context that situates sealing as preparation for endurance. These pieces already shape an answer to our titular question. The 144,000 are identified primarily as God's owned servants, marked, public, and prepared for fidelity. Yet the text does not stop here. The narrative will later show them on Mount Zion with the Lamb, singing a song that only they can learn, bearing names on their foreheads described as first fruits. Those later motifs complicate and deepen the identity John gives them in chapter 7. Before we leave chapter 7, we must note a further nuance. The number may simultaneously serve as a figurative census and as a theological claim about participation in God's people. The phrase, "from every tribe of the sons of Israel," evokes both historical Israel and a reconstituted covenant community. In Revelation, Israel's imagery is frequently reinterpreted by the Lamb's victory. The throne, the elders, the temple imagery are appropriated into a new cosmic worshipping people. The 144,000 thus serves as a hinge. They are Israel-shaped, but that shape may point forward to a more expansive cosmic reality. That is why readers must resist the temptation to pin the 144,000 into a single modern category without acknowledging how the book itself layers ethnic memory and eschatological transformation. And yet, the tribal list's irregularities press the interpreter to account for concrete historical associations: Dan's memory of idolatry, Ephraim's leadership in the northern kingdom's apostasy, Levi's priestly connotations, Manasseh's complicated place as Joseph's son who becomes a tribe. Each item on the roster has a story. John's selection invites the reader to recall that theological stories meet historical realities. The prophetic tradition that condemns and hopes for restoration is thus a critical resource for understanding Revelation's rhetorical moves. At this point we must ask, what did the readers on Patmos and in the 7 Asian churches hear when they read of the sealing? They would have heard a legal claim of ownership, an assurance of protection, and an ethic that called for visible fidelity. They would also have recognized that salvation is not depicted as an anonymous, massed outcome, but as a marked, covenantal belonging that pronounces identity in ways that matter socially and spiritually. For communities on the margins, traders barred from markets, families socially ostracized, Christians pressured to join sacrificial banquets, the idea of being sealed by God had practical implications. It meant that their belonging was not reducible to civic certifications. It meant that loyalty to the Lamb created another economy of recognition, one that could sustain them when imperial recognition failed. We can summarize the textual features that chapter 7 provides: a seal that implies divine ownership and protection, a numerological expression of covenantal fullness, a tribal roster laden with Old Testament resonances, and a dramatic prerogative. Those who are sealed are prepared to endure. But the chapter does not answer every question it raises. The sealed are counted and named in a certain way, but later images will explain their liturgical status, their ethical formation, and their relationship to a broader multitude of worshippers. To press the point in the language of the book itself, the seal marks ownership. The later scene shows the consequences of that ownership in worshipful victory. 7 chapters later, John reprises the 144,000, but the scene is now on Mount Zion. The same set of figures appears, but now they stand in the presence of the Lamb, bearing names on their foreheads and singing a new song that no one else can learn. They are described as not defiled with women, following the Lamb wherever he goes, and as firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. Those terms, virgins, followers, firstfruits, unique song, are dense with meaning. They shift our focus from possession alone to formation, testimony, and liturgy. The sealing was preparatory. The Mount Zion vision promises a fulfillment. Between sealing and singing lies transformation, cost, and worship born of trial. What changed between the sealing under the angel's restraint and the singing on Mount Zion? How do the legal, possessive claims of chapter 7 become the experiential, performative realities of chapter 14? That is precisely the hinge we must examine next. The text itself invites us to track that movement, from ownership to worship, from marked identity to formed life, from count to song. To answer, who are they according to the text? We must allow the text to complete its own trajectory. Before we move to that trajectory in detail, we must reflect on the interpretive responsibilities that Revelation's method imposes. The book's literal historical layer, John's context of late first-century persecution, remains vital. So do its symbolic, typological, and intertextual moves. The interpreter who seeks to assign the 144,000 to a single modern category, purely ethnic, purely symbolic, or purely institutional, will run aground on the text's careful polyvalence. Revelation wants readers to notice both particularity and universality, to reckon with Israel's story while affirming a gathered, worshipping people shaped by suffering. That complexity keeps us honest. The text resists monocausal answers and demands a theology that can hold tension. We have now worked through the sealing scene, the Numbers theological grammar, and the roster's Old Testament echoes. We have canvassed how early Christian interpreters read these oddities and why their voices matter without dictating our conclusion. We have seen how the seal functions as divine possession, how it counterpoints the beast's mark, and how it sets up an eschatological movement from being owned to singing. The next step, moving into Revelation 14's description of the 144,000 on Mount Zion, the language of first fruits, and the song only they can learn, will test the preliminary portrait the text has given. It will show us not merely how John names a people, but how that naming culminates in a way of living and worshipping that arises specifically from the experience of endurance. What we must now do is track the transformation that takes place across the narrative arc. How does the seal's juridical claim become the song's spiritual reality? What do the descriptors in chapter 14, virgins, followers, first fruits, add to chapter 7's emphasis on belonging? And how do these images shape the book's pastoral agenda for communities tempted by Babylon's compromises? These are the precise moves the text makes, and they are the moves we must follow if we want an answer that answers the book on its own terms. 7 chapters later, John reintroduces the same figures, but the stage and the language have changed. The 144,000 are no longer simply a number on a list or a legal inscription assigned before the winds are loosed. They stand on Mount Zion, in the presence of the Lamb, with names written on their foreheads, singing a song that no one else in heaven, on earth, or under the earth can learn. Revelation 14:1-5. That shift, from a sealing scene under angelic restraint to a worship scene on Zion, forces us to press harder on the question the title poses: who are they according to the text? once the book completes its own movement from ownership to worship. If you appreciate careful scripture reading, like this video and subscribe. Our purpose here is to listen carefully to Revelation's own rhetoric and to test competing readings by the text's grammar, imagery, and intertextual echoes. Begin with the setting. Mount Zion in apocalyptic imagination is not merely geographic. It is the locus of God's presence, the place of the Lamb's enthronement, and the center of covenant worship. In Jewish and early Christian thought, Zion connotes eschatological vindication and the gathering of God's people. That the 144,000 appear there signals that John intends to show not only legal belonging, but liturgical identity. These are people who have been formed for worship at the heart of God's reign. Look at the most striking descriptive elements grouped around this image. First, they have the Lamb and the Father's names written on their foreheads. Earlier in the book, the seal Esphragus was also on foreheads. Here the marking becomes a double name, which intensifies the motif of ownership and identification. The forehead in apocalyptic symbolism is the place of visible allegiance. It is public, conscious, and unmistakable. Where the beast will later impose his mark, these foreheads bear the names of God and the Lamb, an unequivocal inscription of whose they are. The text thus amplifies the sealing motif. The legal sign moves into existential embodiment. What was once an external sign granted in time becomes the very visible identity of those who have endured. Second, they sing a new song that no one else can learn. This phrase summons a long biblical tradition. Psalms and prophetic literature speak of new songs as the response to decisive acts of God. See Psalms 33:96, Isaiah's songs of salvation. In Revelation, the motif appears earlier. Those who have been redeemed sing a new song in chapter 5, 5:9-10. What makes the Mount Zion song unique, however, is the text's insistence that none other can learn it. Why? The narrative gives us a hint. In 14:4, they are described as not defiled with women, as ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, and as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. The capacity to sing this song is rooted in a distinctive trajectory of fidelity, experience, and consecration. This is not a metaphor for privileged musical technique. It is a way of saying that their worship has been forged through a particular path of suffering and loyalty that others have not walked. Third, the phrase, "not defiled with women," has been the source of much debate. Read literarily and sensitively to genre and context, the phrase is almost certainly metaphorical. In Revelation, sexual language frequently functions as symbolic shorthand for idolatrous alliances. See the book's recurring figure of Babylon as the great harlot. Thus, to be not defiled with women most naturally means not participating in the sexually charged idolatry of the empire, the cultic acts that bind people to Rome's economic and religious order, rather than a straightforward statement about marital status or literal celibacy. The emphasis is ethical and covenantal. These are persons whose bodies and loyalties have not been compromised by the seductions of imperial power. Fourth, they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Follow, Greek akolatheo, is charged language for discipleship, not mere admiration. In the Gospels and Pauline letters, to follow someone is to adopt their way of life, to accept the costs of accompaniment. Revelation's Lamb is the slain Lamb, the one who embodies sacrificial suffering and victory. So to follow the Lamb is to accept a way of life that risks the world's repudiation and that may entail suffering. Here the textual insistence on following unites ethical imitation with eschatological hope. Their discipleship is costly, visible, and coherent with the Lamb's own trajectory. Fifth, the 144,000 are purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb, 14.4. The Greek term aparche, literally first fruits or first portion, is crucial. In the cultic economy of Israel, first fruits were not the entirety of the harvest, but the initial gift presented in trust that anticipated and guaranteed a larger harvest to come. Theologically, first fruits bear an invested pioneering role. They precede and certify a broader ingathering. When John calls these sealed ones a parche, he assigns them a functional role in salvation history. They stand at the vanguard, the initiation of God's redeeming harvest. That functional designation explains why the 144,000 do not exhaust the book's soteriological imagination. Chapter 7's vision of an innumerable multitude from every nation, 7.9, follows the sealing and indicates a fuller eschatological ingathering. The relationship is not one of exclusivity, but of sequence and typology. First, the first fruits, then the harvest. This first fruits motif also helps explain how the text can simultaneously use Israel's tribal idiom and speak cosmically. The 144,000 are described in Israel-shaped terms, 12 tribes, ancestral markers, but their functional role as first fruits points beyond narrow ethnicity to a vocational leadership role within God's cosmic plan. They display Israelic continuity without exhausting it. They are enacted Israel, the worshipping Israel that leads to the multinational throng of 7.9. The book's own grammar thus supports a layered reading. They are Israelically marked, yet their role is soteriological and ecclesial in scope. Now test those features against the tribal anomalies we discussed earlier, the very oddities of John's roster, the absence of Dan and Ephraim, the inclusion of Levi and Manasseh, acquire renewed significance when placed beside the Mount Zion descriptors. If the 144,000 were simply a literal ethnic census, the tribe list would be a strange error. But if the list carries theological resonance, then the roster's idiosyncrasies help identify the character of the first fruits. Dan's remembered association with idolatry, Ephraim's link to the northern unfaithful tendencies, Levi's cultic identity, and Manasseh's complicated inheritance become markers of the theological possibilities John wants to signal. A people purified for worship, set apart for priestly service, and distinguished from those whose memories are saddled with apostasy. The singing motif also tightens our interpretive possibilities. Why emphasize that their song cannot be learned by others? Because their song is not merely doctrinal assent or abstract praise. It is worship shaped by experience. In the book's narrative economy, the Lamb's victory is not theoretical. It is enacted through the sufferings and witness of those who remained faithful. To sing a new song is to recount a story of endurance, to have a testimony shaped by refusal to buy into the imperial economy, to have witnessed or participated in the costly obedience that the Lamb modeled. Others, those who succumb to Babylon or to the beast's demands, cannot authentically sing that song because they have not walked that path. This observation helps us read the relationship between the 144,000 and the vast multitude of 7.9 more carefully. The innumerable crowd stands in the worshipping assembly before the throne, people from every nation, tribe, people, and tongue. The 144,000 as first fruits are not in competition with that crowd. They are the initiated vanguard. Imagine a harvest metaphor. A few early sheaves are offered at the altar to signify and secure the harvest that follows. Those sheaves are distinct, consecrated, and sacrificially representative, but they do not nullify the larger harvest. Rather, they authenticate it. John's narrative logic makes room for both the particular and the universal, the 144,000 as anointing and the innumerable multitude as ingathering. With these textual features in view, we can fairly test the four major interpretive options scholars and communities have proposed. None of these readings can be embraced or rejected, absent a fair comparison with the full set of textual data, seal, tribe list, Mount Zion song, first fruits language and relation to the great multitude. Let us consider each option and weigh its textual strengths and weaknesses. First, a literal future ethnic Israel reading common in some dispensational frameworks argues that the 144,000 are ethnic Jews, literally sealed in a future tribulation. Strengths. The plain reading of "from the tribes of the sons of Israel" supports an ethnic sense. The precise number and the tribal designations appear to favor an ethnographic reading. Weaknesses. The tribal anomalies, Dan omitted, Levi and Manasseh included, remain awkward if the point was merely to enumerate Israel. The first fruits language and the subsequent vision of a vast multinational multitude raise questions about whether the 144,000 are meant to exhaust the redeemed. Furthermore, the Mount Zion song's language of following the Lamb and its priestly connotations complicate a strictly ethnic census reading, unless ethnic identity is coupled with explicit confession of the Lamb, which the literal future reading must also affirm. In short, a literal ethnic reading is textually possible, but it must reckon with the book's symbolic and liturgical moves and explain the irregular roster. Second, a symbolic or ecclesial reading treats the 144,000 as symbolic of the whole people of God, the Church purified and victorious in its witness. Strengths. The numeric symbolism, 12x 12x 1000, of found fullness, and the book's frequent use of symbolic numbers support this reading. Revelation regularly interprets Israelic categories typologically for the Church. See the New Jerusalem's 12 gates named for the tribes, for instance. The identity markers of worship, priestly service, and following the Lamb fit naturally with an ecclesial portrait. Weaknesses. The text's tribal specificity is oddly precise for purely symbolic representation, and the language of "from the tribes of the sons of Israel" pushes the symbolic reading to explain why John would deploy such concrete ancestral markers if he intends only generic ecclesial symbolism. Additionally, the first fruits language requires that the symbolic reading account for the subsequent innumerable multitude without collapsing the two images into mere synonyms. Third, a messianic remnant, or Jewish Christian remnant reading, suggests that the 144,000 are Jewish followers of the Messiah in John's own time, those within Israel who confess Jesus as Lord and thus become the first fruits of a restored Israel. Strengths. This reading integrates ethnic markers with explicit confession of the Lamb, explaining why Israelic tribe names and Lamb-centered worship coexist. It respects the book's historical context. Persecuted first-century communities containing Jewish and Gentile believers, and it accounts for the first fruits function as the initial ingathering within Israel that opens the way for a broader harvest. Weaknesses. The text's later image of a vast multinational multitude must still be explained. How does a primarily Jewish remnant relate functionally to the Church's widening multinational identity? Messianic remnant interpreters often answer that the remnant is representative and initiatory, but critics argue that the text's cosmic scale, the thousandfold multiplication, invites a reading that transcends narrowly ethnic boundaries. Fourth, a denominationally specific reading, most notably the Jehovah's Witness interpretation, which identifies the 144,000 as a fixed heavenly class, claims a narrowly defined group who alone will reign with Christ in heaven. Strengths. The claim of a limited number who hold a special heavenly role finds apparent support in the text's precise number and first fruits designation. Weaknesses. The text nowhere unambiguously teaches that the 144,000 are the only ones who will enter heaven. Revelation elsewhere, 7:9, 21:3-4, envisions a vast worshipping multitude. Moreover, associating the 144,000 exclusively with an institutional class flattens the book's liturgical and narrative dynamics, the sealing, the following of the Lamb, and the unique song, which are presented as the fruit of a particular way of life, rather than an administrative roster. Across these four options, the text forces any advocate to account for at least 5 features: the seal and the place of marking, foreheads, the specific tribal roster with its anomalies, the first fruits language, the Mount Zion worship scene, including the unique song, and the relation to the innumerable multitude. No single interpretive scheme neatly accounts for every feature without appeal to further claims. The healthiest exegesis names the strengths of each reading while admitting textual ambiguities. The book is both particular and cosmic, ethnically resonant and ecclesially expansive, juridical and liturgical. That polyvalence explains why honest readers across Christian history have proposed different but partially overlapping readings. What remains clear, however, are the 3 positive markers the text repeatedly stresses: the sealed status, the faithfulness of life under pressure, and the perseverance that issues in unique, vindicatory worship. These 3 marks, sealed, faithful, persevering, are not mere abstractions. They are textual actions that shape identity. To be sealed is to be owned by God. To be faithful is to refuse compromise. To persevere is to carry that refusal into witness until worship is formed. Notice how these markers chain together in the book's narrative logic. Divine sealing precedes the test. Faithfulness is the condition that manifests the seal. Perseverance produces the song on Mount Zion. From this synthesis follow pastoral and practical implications for readers in the present. The book addresses communities tempted by accommodation and fearful of loss. Its pastoral thrust is not to speculate about precise end-time logistics, but to form a people in loyalty and endurance. Here are 3 concrete lessons flowing from the text's own emphases. First, fidelity in ordinary days forms identity for crises. The 144,000 are first fruits precisely because their pattern of allegiance was established before the crescendo of judgment. The seal is given prior to the winds being fully released, and the habits that produce fidelity, regular worship, confession of the Lamb, refusal of idolatrous practices, shape the community's ability to stand when trials intensify. Practically, this means cultivating daily practices that make allegiance habitual, communal worship that names Christ as Lord, intentional refusal of compromises that mirror Babylon's seductions, and formation in story through scripture and mutual testimony. A pastoral implication is clear. The question of who will stand is not answered only at the moment of trial. It is answered by the shaping disciplines of ordinary life. Second, Babylon's seduction is incremental and systemic. Resisting it requires discernment and communal courage. Revelation's metaphor of sexualized idolatry helps us see how seduction operates. It is not always a blatant, public renunciation of faith, but often a gradual assimilation to an imperial economy of values, success, consumer entanglement, religious bureaucratic accommodations. The 144,000 status as not defiled with women warns readers to watch the small concessions that become identity-shaping habits. Practically, congregations need tools for discernment, teaching that names modern analogues to Babylon's prostitution, accountability structures that protect the vulnerable from being normalized into compromise, and prophetic communal practices that challenge prevailing cultural goods when they conflict with Christ's lordship. Third, suffering can form a worship that others cannot replicate, worship written in the ink of fidelity. The unique song on Mount Zion is not a trophy of triumphalism. It is testimony forged by endurance. The Church's liturgy and testimony gain credibility not merely by doctrinal precision, but by the perilous integrity of witnesses who chose fidelity over ease. Pastors and leaders should therefore foster communities where testimony and lament are honored alongside doctrinal teaching. Spaces where people can tell of losses that faith has weathered, rituals that commemorate costly refusal, and theological formations that make meaning of suffering without spiritualizing it away. Each of these applications must be held with pastoral sensitivity. Revelation does not promise that the sealed will avoid pain. The imagery of the slain lamb and the book's repeated calls to endurance demonstrate the costliness of fidelity. Nor does Revelation entitle any group to a claim of exclusive heavenly status. The sealed are first fruits, not the entire harvest. The pastoral challenge is to invite believers to imagine their identity under God's ownership, and to live in ways that testify to that ownership when the pressures to conform mount. It is also worth reflecting on the book's direction for leaders and scholars. Exegesis that ignores the book's pastoral aim risks turning Revelation into a mere code for speculative systems. Conversely, pastoral readings that ignore the book's textual particularities, its numbers, its tribe list, its intertextual echoes, lose the depth of its rhetorical artistry. The healthiest posture is the one the book seems to encourage: committed attention to the text's own imagery, while an ethic of humility before its polyvalence. That posture honors both the first-century context of persecution and the enduring challenge Revelation poses to every age. Will we be owned by empire's markers, or will we bear the Lamb's name publicly and risk the consequences? Before we close, let us return to the central question with measured clarity. Who are the 144,000 according to the text? The short answer the book gives is this: they are a divinely sealed group, marked on their foreheads as God's possession, whose identity is defined by faithful discipleship to the Lamb, perseverance under pressure, and a functional role as firstfruits that inaugurate a larger harvest. The text depicts them with Israelic markers that root them in covenant history, yet it simultaneously sets them within a cosmic liturgical drama that reaches beyond ethnic boundaries. The book therefore resists collapsing them into a single modern category. They are not simply ethnic Jews only, nor are they merely an abstract symbol divorced from history. They are real persons in John's narrative who embody the shape of Israelic faithfulness as it is reformed by the Lamb, and who stand at the threshold of a multinational worshipping multitude. That conclusion has several corollaries the attentive reader should note. First, the text's particularities, tribal roster, seal on the forehead, first fruits label, Mount Zion song, are interpretive constraints. Any adequate reading must explain them. Second, the text's ambiguity is deliberate. John wants readers to wrestle with the tension between Israelic memory and cosmic fulfillment. Third, the pastoral thrust is not about exclusivity, but about formation. To be sealed is to be owned. To be owned entails a way of life that can be recognized, tested, and ultimately vindicated in worship. As we end, ask yourself the question Revelation intends: under whose ownership do you live? What is the mark that shapes the shape of your daily choices? The 144,000 invite us to imagine a people whose visible loyalties and daily practices anticipate and authenticate the final harvest. Whether you find the most persuasive reading in a symbolic, ethnic, messianic, or denominational frame, the book's urgent invitation remains. Be counted where God counts, follow the Lamb wherever he goes, and let the habits of ordinary faith shape the song you will sing. If this exploration stirred questions, or you have a reading to test against the text, share your reflections in the comments. If you want to go deeper with the next step in John's vision, join the next episode where we will examine Revelation 14:6-12, an extended packet of proclamations and warnings that expands the book's ethical call and frames the cosmic conflict in sharper terms. Subscribe so you don't miss that close reading, and let us continue listening to what the text insists upon: patiently, humbly, and faithfully.